continue. We're picking up where we left off in Acts 16 on Wednesday here. In just a moment, we'll quickly review the first 5 verses that we took a quick look at as well. Before we get to Acts chapter 16, we want to look at our outline that we've been following in the book. We divided the book down into 2 major sections. 1 through 12 is the gospel in Palestine, and then 13 through 28 is the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. That last section where we are is the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world, because that's where the 3 preaching or missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul take place, and as well as his journey to Rome there at the end. And so he's preaching around. All the first 12 chapters are focused mostly in the area of Judea, Samaria, and in and around the city of Jerusalem. We're in lesson 15, Acts 16. Again, we had one lesson that was 2 chapters, 13 and 14 together, because it was one missionary journey. This missionary journey spans 16, 17, and 18. This journey that they sent off out at the end of 15 after they divided Barnabas and Paul. Paul and Silas going together. Of course, we see Timothy and Luke joining them here in this text. This journey begins about 15, goes about 54 or so. They've found a few different dates. That's approximately the time it took place. Some of your variation in dates has to do with what date people believe Acts 2 took place. Some say 30, some say 33. So you may find some that started about 3 years earlier. Say 47 to 51. That accounts for the difference between those. For some of those, but approximately 50 or so to about 54 is when these 3 chapters are taking place: 16, 17, 18. This is first here's our outline of this. Churches of the first journey visited 1 to 5, from Antioch of Pisidia to Philippi. We'll probably think Antioch in a minute. 6 through 12, and then at Philippi 13 through 40. This is the journey that we're following of the Apostle Paul. If you look here, we're at Antioch here, because they came down to Jerusalem and they go back to Antioch. But they send off, and they go over here on the red on the outbound, and then the black on the return. So we go from Antioch over here towards Tarsus, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, going to places they visited before in the area of Cilicia. And then all of a sudden, after about Antioch, we're going to find up here at Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and going through here on the journey. We'll see why that takes place here in a moment, and why they don't stay in this area right in here. But then we find them going up here, and then they get to Corinth, and they begin to return from Corinth. They go down towards Ephesus, Patmos, over to Paphos on Cyprus, down to Jerusalem, and back up to Antioch. Later in this journey, we get later in the chapter, toward the end of chapter 18. And so that's the journey. We're still focused on sort of this middle area. Right in here is where we're picking up this morning, and where we are in chapter 16 when it opens. Beginning at verse 1. This is where the churches in the first journey are revisited. Verse 1 beginning. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman, who was a believer. But his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. So first in 1 through 3, we have Timothy join Paul and Silas. They come to Derbe and Lystra. It seems he's probably from Lystra. The reason we think he's probably from Lystra is this is the last place mentioned in verse 1 as they're going through journeying. But they come to Lystra, through Derbe and Lystra, and they meet a disciple named Timothy. As we noted on Wednesday, Timothy was likely converted during the first journey as they went through before. Through these same areas. Paul calls him later on in the book of Timothy his son in the faith, perhaps because he had a hand in playing in his conversion. And then this is an area which they had gone through and started these churches on their way through the first preaching journey. So it seems likely that Timothy obeyed the gospel during that first journey.
His grandmother Lois and Eunice would have been preparing him for the Messiah since he was a youth. I think if we look at it from that standpoint, that we learn later that they were preparing for him. So maybe the soul was prepared before he even, if in fact he heard that Paul, when he was converted,
right,
when Paul went through there. But the fact is, I don't think we want to overlook the fact that that groundwork being laid from a youth probably helped establish him not only become a New Testament Christian, but to have that level of commitment that obviously we're going to see, throughout the books of the Bible.
Right, and keep in mind too, to bring that up, we talked before when we talked about how quickly elders were put in these churches, that the journey lasted from 44 to 49, so about 5 years. 4 or 5 years, 3, 4, 5 years, you just sort of get different dates on the first journey. And then keep in mind the second journey is about 50 when we get to this place, get to here. So we're talking, a max of 6 years since Paul went through it the first time? 5 to 6 years? When you take into account the rest of his journey, of course he passes back through these cities on his way back. But you're right, that groundwork was laid. In fact, when Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy, or 2 Timothy chapter 3, how from childhood you've known the Scriptures, you know what he's talking about? The Old Testament. You know how I know that? Because the New Testament is not completed yet. The New Testament's not being completed yet. It's just books that haven't even been written. And so the work hadn't even been completed when that was taking place. But he's known the Scriptures, and he knew what the Old Testament said about the coming of that Messiah. So he had that groundwork, and his mother and his grandmother both had that groundwork. But his father, this is important, his father was a Greek. That's important because Timothy is not circumcised. Not that he had to be, but Timothy's not circumcised. Now keep in mind as they're going through, while their primary work is among the Gentiles, where do they go first?
Jews.
The synagogues.
Into the synagogues, or wherever they may find the Jews gathering. Now, how effective is Timothy going to be in teaching the Jews if he's not circumcised? As a part Jew, his mother being a Jew and his father being Greek, he's half Jew, how effective is he going to be?
It's going to be a hindrance to him to get his foot in the door. And then later on, hopefully, those Jews that maybe were converted would come to that realization of the very thing that they determined, when they were in the council there at Jerusalem, that under New Testament Christianity, you know what I mean,
right,
circumcision, nor any of these other things, because whoever keeps the whole law yet offends at one point is guilty of all. So there's a principle that if we're going to bring circumcision into New Testament Christianity, where does it end? So
right. You're right, and that's a question in here, number 3. Why did Paul have Timothy circumcised and didn't have Titus circumcised? Because we know from Galatians 2, we brought this up last time. Galatians 2, a parallel of Acts 15. Paul sort of puts his foot down when it comes to Titus. Paul puts his foot down when it comes to Titus, you're not going to be circumcised. Titus is a Gentile. But why is it Titus isn't circumcised, yet Timothy is?
Well, it would look like he was yielding to the pressure to keep the old law, Micah. He done this preemptively, with Timothy to get his foot in the door. But if somebody was going to come along and say, you've got to keep this particular command from the old law, and Paul said, okay, then we'll do that. That would have been like, and then in the Galatian letter, he said there was people who came in that were perceived to be men, that really carried some weight, so to speak. He said to them, we did not yield submission even for an hour.
Right. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind on this. So Timothy is for his effectiveness. He's meeting the social customs as well of the Jews to have greater influence. He's part Jew. Titus is not, and Paul has Timothy circumcised to make him more effective with the Jews he's hoping to make Christians. He put his foot down with Titus because the pressure was put on from those who had obeyed the gospel and were Judaizing teachers who were saying he needed to be circumcised. Keep in mind, like when you go to Acts 15, there are Pharisees instead of those who were of the Pharisees, not are, but were of the Pharisees. They had obeyed the gospel, yet they were trying to still bind the law, parts of the law of Moses. So we're talking about two different groups. He's trying to make them effective to open the door with those who have not obeyed the gospel. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul thinking all things to all men. Versus Titus, he's saying, listen, we're not going to yield to these Judaizing teachers who are, as we pointed out last week, as we talked about our sermon last week, they're binding where God is not bound. There's a difference in saying, hey, I think we're going to do this because it's the custom for our people and it'll make you more effective and open the door versus saying, hey, these people are trying to bind where God is not bound, so we're not going to yield to them because they're trying to place something that God has not placed under the new law. So that's the reason Timothy's circumcised and Titus was not.
Timothy jumped to it.
Yes.
He didn't want him to have to deal with this. This was taking care of a problem before it was a problem.
Yes.
Timothy wouldn't have to deal with it, and he wouldn't be with him in every instance.
Right. You're right. When we come to the end of First and Second Timothy, Second Timothy in particular, Paul's on death row. How can we tell his son in the faith? I'm not going to be with you much longer. And we don't know much about Timothy from that point forward because we don't have anything else recorded for us. Timothy had been prepared beforehand, and Paul prepared him several times in that book, prepare for the persecution that's coming, prepare for the difficult time, prepare for the work there is as a preacher. There are all these things going to that place, but you be prepared for that and be ready when that comes, don't be caught by surprise.
Yeah, I know we hopefully all realize that when Paul said, I became all things to all men, as you mentioned there, that he wrote the church for it. In no way did that mean he ever compromised on the doctrine in order to accomplish this. But on those things that he was at liberty to do, okay? And then, so that shows wisdom, but it also shows love on his part. Some of us today might be proud. We might say, well, I know this isn't wrong, I'm not going to do it. Well, love it and pop up. What is it, 1 Corinthians 13, okay? But what Paul do, it's like, hey, not my will, but if this would be a hindrance to teach either the Gentiles or the Jews, then I'll tweak these things that I can tweak, that I'm at liberty to, not doctrinal issues. And that's what he done. I think there's a lesson today because, Paul, where he mentioned there, I think last week about the eating certain meats. Well, Paul wouldn't do it. At times he would. If he knew there was weak brother there, he would do it. And I think the lesson today is, hey, it's not about us. It's about reaching other people. If we can maybe forego some of our liberties because we know that'll let us get our foot in the door like here, then we should have the heart where we do that. Like, Jesus, Paul wrote to the church at Philippi, said, Jesus didn't look on his own interest, but he looked on our interest. He said, let this mind be in you also. So if we truly love the souls of men and women, we will forego things that maybe we want to do to reach others with the gospel without compromising doctrine.
Right. I heard a preacher point out one time, he said, if I go to another country to preach, their customs are different than mine. But if they have a custom they practice, it's not a matter of right or wrong while I'm there. I'm going to observe that custom because if I don't, it's going to hurt my effectiveness. As long as truth is not compromised. And that's in reality what Paul is doing here is, hey, this is a custom of the Jews. And so we're going to circumcise Timothy and make him more effective versus the Judaizing teachers dealing with Titus. Verse 4 now. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered them to the observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders of Jerusalem. What's that reference to?
The letter.
The letter of chapter 15. Circumcision is not binding. Here's what you need to do. So on and so forth. All the things in the letter. They're telling them those things. People didn't know about it. Again, as we pointed out on Wednesday evening, several reasons. But let's just back up for just a second and look at the map again. This is where Paul was at Antioch. We're over here now at Lystra and Derbe. It makes sense to me that the Judaizing teachers came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Perhaps some of them went all the way up into this area of Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, so on and so forth, and were trying to do some of the Judaizing teaching. We know it becomes a widespread problem later on. Even if they hadn't, perhaps some of them had heard the report about some of the things that took place. And again, even if they had not heard that, they're preparing them so if that issue does arise, you're already equipped to know how to answer that. So they're teaching them those things. Verse 5, progress report. We looked at the progress report panels. We have our 6 panels that are in the beginning of our workbook on sort of progress reports about the bigger progress reports, if you will. There's some small ones, but our bigger ones, 16 verse 5 is one. At the end of panel 4, I believe it is. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and they increased in the numbers daily. So they continued teaching. Verse 4, those that were in that area about what happened in Jerusalem, and they had told them all these things. He continued to teach them, and the church strengthened in their faith, and they also increased in numbers. So not only were those that were there already strengthened, more were obeying the gospel as a result of the efforts of Paul and Silas and Timothy. Verse 6 now. We're going from Antioch, the city, to Philippi. May stop for a second and say, wait a minute. It doesn't mention, if you're following on the outline, you see Antioch of the city, but you realize over here in the text, it's not mentioned. When you look at the way that the map breaks it down, let me just back it up again real quick. The way the map is, and where they're going from here, it seems as though they probably already made their way to Antioch. It may not be stated, but there are places they would have stopped along the way that may not have specifically mentioned if details aren't taking place. So it seems they're probably already at Antioch when the events take place of 16:6 through verse 12 here in a minute, because of what all is taking place. Verses 6 through 8. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. Verse 6, it says the Holy Spirit forbade them to speak the word in Asia. It says in verse 7, the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them to continue on. Why? I don't know. Because it doesn't tell us. But whatever the reason is, they weren't to go into the area, here in these areas of Asia. And so we're going to get to what is referred to here in a minute as, oftentimes referred to as the Macedonian call, where they go into the area of Macedonia, which we're going to find them come in Philippi here in just a minute. But as for the question, why were they told not to come? We don't know, because we aren't told. If we're not told, we just can't answer that question. Verse 9 now. And a vision appeared to Paul at night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging them and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we resolved to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. So there's the call to Macedonia, 9 and 10, so they moved their way to Philippi, verse 11. Something interesting to note here. As you're reading along, you'll notice there is a change in the pronouns that is being used by Luke. Look at back up into verse 7. And when they had attempted to go into Mysia, verse 6, and they went through the region of Phrygia. Now I'll come down to verse 10. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we. So, at this point, we've got at least 4 people traveling together. Could there be more that we're not named, that we're leading? Yes, there could have been more than just the 4, but we know there are 4. Paul, we know that from Acts 15 and verse 40. Silas, same verse, Acts 15 and verse 40, they set out together. Verse 3 of this chapter, as we just saw, Timothy joined them. And verse 10, the author joins them. We know as we conclude the evidence before, the author is Luke. So Luke joins them here in verse 10. Now we'll come later on and then Luke will leave them. He goes from using we to they, and then he rejoins them later on again and he says we again. So if you follow along, you can tell when Luke's with them or not, even though then I said he may stop somewhere and they go on, but he's in another city for a time, or he may go to another city for a time. We can tell we don't know where he went, but we know he leaves because he goes from saying we were going to they were going to we were going, and he shifts back and forth, depending on when he's with them or not. Yes.
You think about, we don't want to overlook the fact that God looks down from heaven. In Hebrew, I said in the 4th chapter, He's discerner of the thoughts, the intents, the heart, and all things are naked to His eyes. Well, God would have saw the hearts of these Macedonians here, these people in these different cities, that they were going to be receptive to the word. Maybe at that time He knew that in Asia or wherever that they weren't going to be. And then you can look at specific examples. Cornelius was looking. So what happened? Okay, he was given the word by one of the servants. But Paul apparently had the right word. God saying to see Ananias. The Ethiopian eunuch was going along with his chariot. He was seeking apparently. So I think when we kind of step back from this and see specific examples where God looks down from heaven and that He sees a heart that's really hungry and thirsty to find Him, that, I don't think we just want to write this off the chance that these people were put into their life, but rather God works in that fashion.
Right. You're right. It wasn't because they didn't need the gospel. In fact, some of the areas in which they would have been headed were also areas that had already been at one point already. Perhaps the thought was maybe perhaps God was sending them somewhere else because churches could be established. We don't know the specifics, but God has His God would provide opportunities for them to hear the gospel. Because if he didn't, and he says, no, don't go to him, and he just listens, that's a respecter of persons. We know God is not a respecter of persons who shows partiality.
My verse 10 doesn't say anything about Luke.
Do what?
My verse 10 does not say anything about Luke.
Where it shifts in the pronouns, he should say immediately we sought to go to Macedonia.
Yes.
That's when Luke joins him. He says they before and we so.
Oh,
When the pronouns shift, he's now talking about himself as being part of the group.
Because he's the author.
Yeah, because he's the author, so he's part of the group now. So they, here's them going without him. Now when he shifts to the use of we, that's when we know Luke's with him. Because he's talking about whoever the author is, which we looked at the evidence before, is Luke. He's with them going on that journey. So as we come later on in the text, we'll see again where he says they, so we know Luke's not with them. And then when Paul's actually sailing to Rome, we hear we on that journey. Luke was with him on that journey to Rome on that ship, as he talks in 27 about we later on again. So that's how we know Luke was with them from verse 10, is because of the shift of how he refers to the group that's traveling.
okay.
Coming down to verse 13, through verse 40, he's at Philippi. Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke, they're all at Philippi. There's a couple of stories that happen here. 13 through 15, we have the conversion of Lydia, the damsel, or the woman with the spirit of divination, Paul and Silas in prison, and then the conversion of the jailer, taking place here in this early part at Philippi. And then another one is not putting on the board just yet, the release from jail in 35 through 40 and depart the city. Let's start at 13 through 15, conversion of Lydia. And on the Sabbath day, we went out to the outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the woman who had come, the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. So, a couple of interesting things to note in this section of verse 13. They don't go to the synagogue. Okay? Why do they not go to the synagogue on the Sabbath? That's where they always go, right? Because Philippi doesn't have one. So where do the Jews gather? Where the people gather to pray? At the riverside. So where do they go? To the riverside. They go where the people are. So something interesting to note about Paul and his work as you go through, if he comes to a city without a synagogue, he may go to the marketplace. As a side note, the marketplace is not the place where they would just go buy and sell goods. It's actually not a place where they would actually exchange conversations and exchange some ideas in these marketplaces. Some of these marketplaces where you can find them. You may find him in an area of town. You may be at the river like he is here. You may go to the synagogue. It's interesting to note this because Paul went where the people were to hear the gospel. So, Paul didn't stop and say, okay, I'm going to stay in this inn or this house or whatever, and I'm going to be preaching, and whoever wants to come find me. Paul went out to find people and try to teach them the message. He wasn't passive in his teaching and waiting for other people to take the action. He was active in the teaching. He went to the cities. He went to where the people were gathered, and he taught them those messages here. So it's an interesting thing to note about it, that he goes where the people are because he's trying to make sure that all the people that will listen have an opportunity to hear the truth.
Hey, Mike, there's a brother at Peyton City Church, I won't mention his name, but he actually flew to Romania. He didn't speak their language, but he had pre-printed this information out about the gospel in Romanian language. And he went over on the streets and just handed it out. And sometimes we don't want to get out of our comfort zone, but I think that's worthy of commending that man for doing that kind of thing, because, we just want, we'll come maybe 3 times a week. It's not inconvenient to the assembly. There's people out there that their whole heart is in serving God.
Right.
I just thought, when I heard that, I thought, what a remarkable thing to hear about a brother in Christ.
You're right, and again, like with Paul, that's taking the active, not just being passive in our teaching. And what I mean by being passive, obviously we have to go through the active teaching. If somebody comes, but what I mean by being active versus passive is we're taking that action to find that opportunity to teach versus waiting for an opportunity. Sometimes we have opportunity to knock. Sometimes we have to go knocking to find that opportunity.
A lot of them countries too, Mike, if they know you're American, that automatically puts you at odds with them, and your life is at risk. So what I'm saying is, I don't think we want to underestimate, just like the example of that man that I told you about. I mean, it wasn't like, hey, he's going to this place that's necessarily friendly to Americans or whatever like that. So what did he do? He loved serving God more than he did his own life.
You're right. You're right. That's an important lesson for us to learn. Let's look at a statement real quick in down in verse number 14. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention. There are some that take verse 14 and try to run with it. And say, you see, the Lord chose her to be one to obey the gospel. There's some that sort of have a field day with verse 14. Verse 14 is not saying that God basically forced her to obey the gospel or gave her no choice. She has free will. Just like we have free will. What does it mean then? For question 5, what does it mean that the Lord opened Lydia's heart?
The power is in the Word. The power of the gospel, Romans 1:16. That's where the power is at. So like there are two components in a conversion. It's the seed or the word and the soul, or the word and the heart. Apparently she had that heart that was able to receive the word of God.
You're right. That's exactly what happens. It's just the fact that the gospel pricks her heart. She willingly heard the gospel, by the way. They go down to this area, and one who heard us was Lydia, who's a worshiper of God. She was eager to hear, it seems, the gospel as they were preaching it. She willingly listened. She wasn't forced against her will to listen to the gospel. She willingly listened. She could have got up and left at any time if she actually wanted to hear it. And it pricked her heart, and because of that, she obeyed. That's what it means that he opened Lydia's heart. It doesn't mean that he basically forced her to obey. You go through, it's the Calvinists that have a field day with this verse. You go through 5 points of Calvinism. Remember memorize by tulip, total depravity, unconditional election. That is, you're basically chosen to be saved. God chooses, and there's so many that are chosen, and the rest aren't, and He predetermines it. So they try to have a field day with that verse there. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that it's pointing out the gospel. It was the word of the Lord that pricked her heart because she willingly listened and she obeyed. And that's what it means that He opened her heart.
That's a good study, Mike, because Paul wrote to the church at Rome. He said, who God wills, He will harden, who He will. He lets them get the word. And he said, well, now the play, are you going to ask the Father why you done so? Mm-hmm. So you can see where a lot of this takes some study to really navigate through it, so that predestination isn't, because then that would contradict other things, that God's not willing that any should perish. And if it was predetermined who's going to be saved, who's going to be lost, what would be the purpose of any of this? But when you read the Roman letter, it kind of gets a little bit complicated there. Mm-hmm. You really got to dig deep to sort it out. Right,
you're right. That is, I would say probably after Revelation, it's the most complicated New Testament book. Romans is. It's always worth pointing out, sometimes people look at things and say that they're impossible to understand. There's a difference in difficult and possible. And when we look through that, we can answer those questions that people try to raise and twist the scriptures that they use. One more point we want to make before we move on. Our time's almost away, so we want to finish here so we pick up verse 16 on Wednesday. Verse 15 says, after she was baptized in her household as well, she urged us, saying, if you were just to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. She fell upon us. So real quick, I'll answer this. Question 6 was asking how do we answer the contention that Lydia's household was baptized, so infants must be baptized. A couple of things we have to realize about that. Somebody may come to you and say, well, you see, infants can be baptized because Lydia's household was. Number one, you're assuming that she was married and had children. You're assuming that. Number two, you're assuming if she had children, they were infants in order to assume that infants were baptized. Not only does she have to have children, you have to assume she has children, you have to assume that the children are still infants. She may have had teenage children if she had children. We don't know. So we're having to assume that those are the case. And even if we could prove she had infants, we can still prove that they were baptized, because those who are baptized have to be penitent, Acts 2:38, believers, Mark 16:16. And an infant is not old enough to be a penitent believer.